Hello. So we'd like to talk about microfinance, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the deal with that is. But before I jump into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about sort of the way we think about poverty and the institutions that we use to navigate that. You're stuck with me because one of our board members is in India and another's in Uganda trying to save the world. So with this exhibit, you saw a lot of really, really interesting designs. Well, what happens after you come up with the good idea? The problems of resource allocation, production, and distribution are things that economists and business people get really excited about because these are easily quantifiable problems, right? So how would you go about rolling out one of these incredible life-changing products? One way you could do it is that you could legislate subsidies or provide incentives through the mechanism of the state. You could sell them on the free market, or you could give them away with charity. Now, each of these has their own strengths and weaknesses. This is an overly complicated graph showing how poor people use microfinance, but it's pretty much the same thing for regular people and the way they use finance. You know, emergency happens, you need a little bit extra cash, or you want to invest in something long-term. Credit's a pretty handy thing. So the way we would do it is we would just, go into the bank and say, well, hello, Mr. Banker. This piece of paper proves that I own this house, and if I don't pay the loan, you can take my house away. The problem is that the other 90% don't actually have maybe legal claim to the place that they live while they have a structure and they occupy some property. They don't necessarily own it. So each of these 168 points indicate a place or a government bureaucratic office that you would go to formalize an informal land claim in the Philippines. This takes 13 to 25 years if you follow all of the rules. So it's tricky. So this whole poverty thing, we can think about it in terms of a political angle, an economic angle, a health angle, and it's sort of a multidimensional problem. And the way we look at sort of fixing this thing is from a top-down sort of approach through these agencies like the state or the market. However, the other 90% doesn't actually have access to these things, which makes it really tricky. These can actually be exclusive. This is a microfinance solidarity group that I met in Cartagena, Colombia. I put this photograph in there because there's a lot of people there, but you don't actually see their faces. And that's kind of the nature of the way a lot of poverty works. It's off the radar. These are people that are excluded from the systems. So if we use the systems to find out how to fix this problem, there's sort of this inherent bias. Well, in comes microfinance, and the idea is that you take a loan, a very small loan, and give it directly to people because they know exactly what to do with it. Whether it's buy a chicken or a sewing machine or, the situation varies incredibly. So it's not that you just give a small loan to a person. Generally speaking, like 80-some% of loan recipients are women. And the idea is that if you give it to a woman, she will invest it directly into the family unit. And if you get kids into school or provide for them, in the long run, these pay economic dividends because you have a more educated populace. Well, it's not just that you give a loan to a woman, you give a loan to a group of women. And the idea behind that is that your neighbors have a pretty good idea of who's creditworthy. The folks in the community know you. Actually, a lot better than the banker. So they'll know who's creditworthy and who's not. And furthermore, you also have a group to help support the payback of that. So these microloans go for micro enterprises, which is usually a small business, something that is an extension of household labor. Maybe taking in additional sewing, making some extra food and selling it. And this helps even out cyclical cycles. Maybe the men are working agriculture and there's an off-season for that. So it helps even some of those cycles. So that's the basic idea behind microfinance, but there's a whole bunch of different models and ways that you can slice this sort of problem of getting capital to people, which is why I picked a lot of tomatoes for that slide. So this is another overly complicated graphic, but the point is that this is the sort of a flow chart of how you might put together a small group, a solidarity group, and then get a loan and pay for it. The point is that there's a certain number of steps, regardless of the size of the loan, that have to be taken care of. Due diligence. You need to screen some loan applicants, decide who gets it, and then collect on it. So interest rates for microfinance loans, because they're usually pretty small, the loans themselves, the interest rates are pretty high. So there's been a lot of interesting innovations that have happened based on these sort of premises. I'm sure many of you heard of kiva.org, whereby for 25 bucks you can give a loan directly to folks. This is so fast. This takes us to a fork in the road. And one of these is of regulation, because there's this big pile of global wealth out there that says, we want to put this money to good work. But if there's not adequate definitions of, well, this is what an MFI is, or this is what it isn't, this is what kind of rates we get. There's so many different models out there, and there's not any regulation, so there's sort of a barrier that this money doesn't necessarily trust itself to go that route. The other problem is impact assessment, and that's knowing that the money that's actually out there is making people's lives noticeably better. Another way of saying that is social performance management. So, there's a lot of big claims about this microfinance stuff, and you got to make sure it's not just a bunch of window dressing. So despite these big claims, there's not necessarily a lot of research. There's a couple of other sort of criticisms and critiques. This is already a vulnerable population, so they're subject to something like predatory lending. Depending on where you place your interest rates depends on the size of the loans you get. So how small loans are you going to send out there to the point where you can even make lending, much like it is here, a profitable endeavor? Is everybody really an entrepreneur? People can spend an entire life in debt. And it makes me wonder, well, where does it leave this guy? This is a Mayan in Guatemala. He does not speak Spanish as a first language. He probably doesn't have any collateral. And yet at the end of the day, he's got his asset right there, his machete. And he both cuts his lawn and his vegetables with that. And if you notice, he's got a garden behind him. So he may make less than $2 a day, and if we define him as impoverished, well, if he can feed his family and they're secure, is he really in poverty? Those are the things we like to think about at the Microfinance Alliance. Thank you for your time.